In June of 1550, the Germanic inhabitants of Alençon fomented revolt from their French overlords, and in this way, the Netherlands declared independence from Alençon, declaring war upon their mother country. Meanwhile, in the homeland, 25 royal regiments were raised to defeat the rebellious nobility. In 1551, the crown troops met the marauding rebels in open combat at Aberdeenshire. The battle was a rather crushing defeat, however, and the crown was forced to take out expensive loans from the only available lender who was willing to pay in such quantities: the Blood faction, hiring mercenaries with the funds. After suffering a second loss at Glasgow with these aforementioned mercenaries, the third battle in 1552 was fought instead by the Blood faction, who took the opportunity to defeat the Robe faction in combat, but also take implicit control of Aberdeenshire, Glasgow, and Dublin. The economy suffered briefly, but was quickly rectified with the colonial tax income from Pert Goram. Meanwhile, in June of 1554, the High Lords were making their moves once again, fomenting the colonists of Vannin, Brazil to complain of their tax burden to the crown, especially the 10% price increase on sugar and fish, as well as the harbor tax. Vannonia needed the income from its most lucrative colony in order to maintain a stable economy and pay off its loans. So, Empress Euphrosyne decided to remind them who ruled the colonies and stood her ground, refusing to lower the colonies' tax burden at the behest of their petty whims halfway across the world. That same year, past the former holdings of the Mongols was the Muslim kingdom of Bukhara, which made use of small metal balls filled with black powder and debris to great effect, beginning to conquer much of the Middle East around this time. In 1555, to the dismay of the Crown faction, Euphrosyne passed away in her sleep, leaving her young son Crimton on the throne in the care of a regency council. In 1556, the Dutch lost their independence war with Alençon, and the Netherlands were reclaimed. Meanwhile, even with the colonial taxes, the Crown remained unable to cope with the loans from the Blood faction, and saw the economy begin to spiral out of control. In their panic, the Crown faction elected to shutter most of its forts and stand down some of its standing army. Crimton's regency ended in 1558, ruling over an empire on the very brink of chaos. That same year, Bukhara was rebuffed by the collective effort of those who used to be ruled by the Mongols, beginning a decade of chaos and bloody civil war in Eastern Europe. The sickly Crimton, unable to cope with the stresses of the crown, fell ill and died, thus ending the false branch of the Monad line in 1560 after 65 years of rule. As such, Chazon Monad, son of Asmund, head of the Blood faction and true royal family of Vannonia, expected the Crown faction to acquiesce to him at any moment. Meanwhile, the Crown faction, which had once so legitimate and well-founded a claim to power, now had nothing, no excuse to cling to their places thronging around the throne. Regardless, the relatively faceless mass of aristocrats, courtiers, and military commanders that had thrown in their lot with the Crown faction feared what Chazon would do to them should he ascend to the throne, given that they worked against the true bloodline from the start. As such, under the cover of night, the Crown faction sent a secret delegation to Europe, bringing back Crimton's nephew from Lombardia, crowning him Emperor Cyrus Brancovanesti, first of the Brancovanesti line. As the sun rose on the 14th of July, 1560, Chazon Monad declared himself the true Emperor of Vannonia and brought the force of the Blood faction to bear against the crown. Hearing of this news, the High Lords of the Robe faction stirred up their rhetoric amongst the colonists of the land yet again, fabricating that the new foreigner tyrant Cyrus had raised taxes even more to fight the Blood faction, beginning to wage their war of independence for Vannin, Brazil. And so, it was in this way that the Lagen de Folly, or the Days of Blood, began. The first months of the war brought the entire empire to the very brink of destruction, and indeed moved very quickly. The Robe faction, using the War of Independence as a cover and excuse to move against the crown, their loyal agents in their patrimonies of the Old World rose up and assaulted all parties involved, managing to annex Renk and Naren for their side, though they lost any control of Halby and Sotsin. Halby ended up being the headquarters of Emperor Chazon and his Blood faction, though he was keen to move against the Robe faction as well, invading Naren and splitting that island in twain. The Crown faction managed to stabilize its position due to the immense wealth of the Brancovanesti family, even staging a counterattack and re-annexing Rank from their base of operations out of Sotsin and the Isle of Vannin itself. Tens of thousands died during that period, the devastating effects of gunpowder warfare nearly impossible to prepare for. For example, the battles that led to the territorial divisions they each held were the bloodiest in Vannonian history. The Battle of Chashtal saw the Blood faction surround the Great Isle with ships which bombarded the city of castles itself for weeks, until Crown ships came sailing down from the north, driving them back, leaving thousands of bodies floating in the sea, and thousands more dead and starving in the walls of the capital Chashtal. The Battle of Glasgow, where the Crown attempted to unseat the Blood faction from Halby in the north, was characterized by the Crown faction attempting to light the city on fire, and succeeding for a time before the denizens were able to put it out, then charging through the flames against the forces of the Pretender, decimating them. That battle left innumerable unburied dead, spoiling the crop in the region and causing famine that year. The Battle of Dublin, where the Blood faction attempted to drive out the Robe faction from Naren, saw the soldiers within chain orphans to the walls, then fire upon the forces of the Blood, and the armies of Chazon bombarding the city anyway. In his own words, "To take any city, we were going to be killing children regardless. It does not matter if we can see them or not." In short, these accounts illustrate that all of the hundreds of battles that took place during this period were unfathomably brutal and headed up by men who cared not for human life or its sanctity, only its utility in the service of their goals. Regardless, of the three, the Crown faction was put on the back foot, the Blood and Robe factions each making progress towards the capital city. Emperor Cyrus could feel his precious new crown slipping through his fingers. Many of the people hoped it would. Anything to bring the days of blood to an end. Indeed, in the region of Rank, 23 peasant regiments, which is to say 23,000 peasants, rose up against the crown, sorely displeased with the horrors they had been subjected to. That revolt would simply be left to fester, as nobody involved could spare the resources. The rebels took Amsterdam, which became a lawless place they called a free city. Their population would come to swell as a place safe from the days of blood. Meanwhile, in August of 1562, a small church stands in the quiet province of Toulouse, Occitania, a monk of little renown declaring his discontent with the church from his own steps. This was seen as a relatively minor incident until, of course, it wasn't. The Protestant Reformation began on the 1st of November 1563, and with it, Emperor Cyrus found an opportunity for a kind of salvation. As the ideas of that monk, Martinel Luca, spread like wildfire throughout that country, Emperor Cyrus Brancovanesti founded the Church of the Isle, modeled after his teachings, those being the elimination of indulgences, ceasing the veneration of the saints, rejection of the Marian doctrines, and above all, rejection of the Pope, among a great many other things. The Emperor, caught up in the schismatic genius of his plan, demanded the scholars of the Church of St. Guthlac translate the Bible into the vernacular. In response, these scholars fled to Glasgow, pledging allegiance to the true blood of the Monad line. Emperor Cyrus still managed to get it translated into dozens of languages, and disseminated the copies to the nations of Europe by way of a revolutionary new technology, the printing press. As those sparks flew towards the rest of Europe, millions more would come to call the present age the days of blood.